Hey everybody, today I'd like to talk about how hard should it be? How hard should sim racing be? And I'm gonna start right away by telling you there will not be an answer to that question, but there might be some things we can talk about. First, however, I don't think I've shown you my best thing in the whole room. It's a little tile that Remco once gave to me for my birthday. Just some nice factual information before we start this video. So, I've been making a couple of videos recently about tire data and how different that is and how unreliable perhaps it is. So, that made me sort of wonder, okay, but we all want realism in our racing simulations, but what is realism? And that's what I want to talk about. So, let's dive straight in with when you're making a race simulation, you get data, right? You get something from the race teams, from the manufacturer, from the tire companies, but it's never 100% complete. Things are just lacking sometimes. For example, if you work for Dallara, where they make a whole bunch of different single-seaters, as you probably are aware, you get some information from them. For example, the aerodynamics. Typically, they put their scale model of a car in a wind tunnel, and they test it at various ride heights so you can get a good idea of how sensitive the aero is. That's great, but the wind tunnel is small, it's a scale model, and you don't never really know what sort of correlation you get with reality. You would hope and assume it's certainly not bad, but what's the tolerance there? 2%, 5%, 10%? It's really hard to tell. As well, lots of the time, the data is only for a car going straight ahead. And sometimes you get a little bit of yaw, a little bit of sideways data as well. But that typically is very limited to 3 or perhaps 6 degrees, which is, you don't want to be at a bigger angle than 6 degrees most of the time. But in a simulator, if you make a mistake or you have a bit of oversteer, you might have moments that exceed those slip angles, right? So ideally, you'd have wind tunnel data at like 15 or 20 degrees, which is sort of the worst case slide you will actually encounter when making a mistake on the real track. So that's something where even though they supply aero data, it's from a scale model, so it's not gonna correlate perfectly. Because wind tunnels, I don't know what the accuracy is, but there will be some inaccuracies, and they don't measure at all the conditions that might occur with the real car. Tires we talked about, that often you don't get the data, and well, you got to see my previous video on this, but tire data is not always reliable and also only covers a small range of slip and slide where it might be reliable, even though it probably isn't. So that's a whole bunch of stuff that's missing. But you also get a lot of stuff that is sort of more reliable. In the car manuals from Dallara in this example, you get stuff like, where are the suspension pickup points? Some information about the dampers and the spring rates and the motion ratios and the dimensions of the whole thing. There's lots of useful information in there. But even then, I've seen some mistakes because these people at Dallara, of course, they do their job and they do their best, but they are not the racing team that races this car and depends on the accuracy of the data in order to win the championship. So a lot of the time, cars only change a little bit from season to season. And perhaps they missed a little update, they didn't update the manual, or the manual, so there's a little error in it. And a lot of the times you will see revisions where some error was found and updated. In other words, it's nothing against this manufacturer, it's just people work there, they make mistakes. And even if the data is known and they want to give you the data, every now and then something might creep in that's from the last generation car or incorrect in some other way. So just there, your data, whatever you get, and it doesn't matter if you're iRacing, RF2, Rise Studios, or Turn 10, who makes Forza, doesn't matter. The data you get will not be complete, and it will not be accurate, simply impossible. So, what else do you get? Hopefully, telemetry. That means like you drive the car on the track, and then you plug in the computer and you download the data. You can do it in most sims as well. And you see the g-forces, the speeds, the suspension position, everything. Well, first of all, that greatly depends. A lot of the time, telemetry systems on cars are quite simple. and they may use GPS, for example, for a lot of the stuff. So that's a global positioning satellite. Here's a satellite. There's your car. More accurate satellite. Like that. And then the satellite checks where the car is and how quick it's going and stuff like that. Great idea, but the accuracy isn't great, especially if you have like quick transitions or peaks, like suddenly braking hard. GPS, the rate is quite low, and the accuracy is therefore not always great. But the speed could probably be realistic. If you have a long straight, GPS says you're doing 200 miles an hour, it might be quite accurate. But that's just one thing. A lot of the time they get the speed of the car. How do they get the speed of the car? Well, the rotational speed of the tires, for example, is often used to calculate the speed of the car. And that seems to make sense, but it actually doesn't completely make sense. It's good enough, but the tire grows and shrinks a little bit based on the downforce and the speed that it turns at. Now, it's not that much, and it's not the same. Oh, we're getting complicated already. No spreadsheets though. Oddly enough, even if a tire is squished, the actual radius that you have to calculate with to get the speed doesn't change as much as it is squished. So the difference is small, but there's still a difference, and just using a constant to multiply your tire rotational speed to get the actual car speed, you will be off by a couple miles an hour at the end of the straight, or a couple miles an hour at low speed. There will be some tolerances there. So even there, real sensors on a real car are not reliable. And sensors on the real car all have their tolerances, and they need to be calibrated a lot of the time. So that depends on how good your sensor guy is in the team, how good your sensors are. Sensors are very expensive, so perhaps, it's been long overdue for a replacement, but you're going to use them for another year, or they're installed, but they're a bit wobbly, so there's a bit inaccuracy there, or the calibration is a bit off. So you don't really know that if you read the sensor data and it says this much millimeters or this pressure, there will also be a tolerance there. Even though it's real data, there's a slight tolerance. And if you measure the acceleration of the car, the g-forces, not by GPS, but with a g-force sensor, an accelerometer somewhere in the car, it actually depends where you put it in the car. If it's not at the center of gravity of the car, but way in front or way at the back, and you get like quick rotations, you might actually see some incorrect values of the g-forces as well. And I've also seen the calibration being wrong, that a car going perfectly straight, steering wheel like this, going on a straight line, somehow pulled half a g to the left. That's just something that telemetry is ideal. You want it, it's helpful, but there's lots of stuff going on with it that's just not quite accurate. So that's very important to do. And sometimes with telemetry, you can try and derive stuff from it, right? So if you don't know for sure what the aerodynamics of the car are, you can always apply some sensors, like ride height sensors or strain gauges on the suspension, to try and measure the loads on the suspension and the ride heights, and then you can derive the aerodynamics, perhaps, which is definitely something you can kind of do. But then you're using these sensors and you're doing calculations on them, and they will all have their tolerances. And you're driving a car on a straight, you don't know what the wind conditions is important. Always a bit bumpy, right? So you have to average a lot of data, and it's definitely useful, but it's not absolute. There will always be a bit of a tolerance. That's what I'm saying. So real data, what you get from the manufacturer, from the tires, from the car, from the engine, everything has its tolerances. Some have big tolerances, some have very small tolerances. There's human error in the data, and telemetry from the car on the track will have its tolerances and errors as well. Plus, telemetry of the real car is no longer objective because it's driven by a driver. And who knows, perhaps you've got the most professional, quickest guy on the planet, but even two guys with similar speed could have different styles, so you cannot really interpret the way the car drives to some extent from the telemetry, because two people might drive it somewhat differently. Or a lot of the time, you're working with data from a guy who's not a world champion, and you have to wonder, okay, is he simply braking a bit too early here? Is he missing some mid-corner speed? You know, you're not necessarily looking at the limits of the car all the time when you have telemetry. So, more questions raised than answers, as is my sort of trademark, I suppose, now. So there is really no way you can be 100% sure you get good data, and telemetry is not reliable. So then we go to the simulator. The sim, of course, very complicated physics engines and physics models. They're also not accurate, right? And also never complete. There's always stuff not modeled or modeled incorrectly. So you have a whole bunch of real data that's not completely random, absolutely not, but there is definitely quite a big tolerance on that. Then you have your simulator that also has its tolerances and its unrealism, and you sort of have to put the two together. So I just want to point that out, that even before you actually start driving anything in a sim, there is a lot of stuff you simply don't know, and that includes stuff like how hard is it? Remember, the tire data we had does not give you accurate information about how it is when you're going sideways. And the aero data, if you get anything, which is great, you might not get it beyond this sideways, and you might not get the downforce levels when you're this sideways. So, such a number of parameters involved that quite a few of them you simply don't know for sure. That means when you make your simulator, subjectivity cannot be avoided. You can never say this is how it is, this is realistic. Almost all the time there is tolerance and question marks. So what it comes down to then a lot of the time is you're sort of feeling the simulator, right? That's what you drive. That's a subjective feel of what you experience. But what are some issues there? Well, a lot of the time people say, well, in a sim there are no g-forces, which is true. Some people try motion, but that tends to add randomly incorrect g-forces rather than actual proper ones. So a lot of the time, motion definitely doesn't add realism from the g-forces point of view anyway, perhaps vibrations and stuff like that, but not realism in g-forces. However, g-forces, if you have them or if you don't have them, I'm not so sure. I'm, big question mark here as well. I'm sort of a living question mark here. Does it make it harder or easier if you don't have the g-forces? You might say, well, you don't feel, your butt is sort of not in the car, you don't feel the g-forces, it's harder. But proper racing cars, right, like a Formula 2 car, super stiff, you're being bounced around on the straight, your teeth are falling out, and then you have to slam the brake pedal with 290 pounds or 140 kilos of force. And you have to somehow keep your brain sort of focused during all this. In a sim, you've got the serenity, so you can really focus on what your leg does, what your arms do, and your eyes aren't sort of shaken out of their sockets. So I'm not so sure if the lack of g-forces is actually making it harder or easier. It's really hard to tell, isn't it? So I wouldn't automatically assume that a sim is harder to drive because of the lack of g-forces. Perhaps it is. I'm not saying it's like that, but you could come up with an argument that says, well, perhaps the ferocity and the violence of real racing is actually getting in the way of proper feel and subtlety behind the wheel. Who knows, right? It's something to think about. And when you go from real to the sim, there is a lack of awareness and a sense of speed as well. I've done almost no real track time, but the feeling of approaching a corner at 100-something miles an hour in a real car versus casually being in a simulator while texting on your phone and, I don't know, thinking about doing the dishes, it's different, right? It's just, well, the difference of being a game, ultimately, still a game, or real life where things are actually happening. That's a big sort of consciousness difference. And the sense of speed as well. It's not so much the sense of speed, but it might also be, but just that sense of, well, this is actually what I'm doing now, and it has consequences, versus I'm in a sim and I'm just having a good time. What it can result to is that perhaps in the sim you're overconfident, you're overdriving, you go too fast, whereas in real life you think twice or 3 times or 4 times before you add another 5 miles an hour into that corner. It just makes it very hard to compare the sim and real, and what you feel and what you do in a sim is probably not what you feel, what you would have done in the real car. Just some, another thing to go like this about. A sort of summary of the video. No idea. But, something to think about. Things like the force feedback. Sometimes the force feedback can be very informative and very quick, to the point where you wonder, is it really that sort of helpful in real life, or is it actually overdone a bit in the sim? I don't know. I've heard drivers say it's pretty good. I've heard drivers say it's too responsive a lot of the time in a sim. I kind of value both of these people's opinion. There's that face again, It's not that simple. But it helps a lot, of course. If your force feedback is very communicative, it helps you drive the car and makes it easier. Or should it be harder? Complicated, right? Braking. Now, perhaps I design and build sim pedals and also brake pedals. But how can you compare the braking from reality and how it feels in the sim? It's different. Even if it's all set up the same way, in real life you have that ferocity, that violence, right? End of the straight, your teeth are rattling out and you slam on the brake. You feel like you're being punched in the back of your head. Just that violence. Can you actually sort of get a good feel for what the sim is doing with that violence not being there? It's just really different. Throttle mapping, for example, might be different in the sim versus in the real car, because guess what? The data that I mentioned isn't always complete. Throttle engine maps are very rarely present, so you have to sort of do one of those and hope you're somewhere close. So even if the driver applies identical throttle in the sim, might not always result in the actual same car acceleration as it would do in real life. No data, different feel, and how accurate are you with the throttle pedal when you have a stiff car, you're being bounced around and you're approaching a tire barrier and you're supposed to go on the throttle smoothly? That's different from being in a sim and being smooth and in control and not having any of those worries. So some big difference. And I can go on forever, so I will. Bad simulator setup. How often have you seen people driving with weird field of view, or they have like these big televisions, especially some years ago, they were terrible with input lag. That makes the driving so much more difficult, even though they might be playing the same game, same sim as anybody else with a better setup, who would have an easier time. So imagine entry-level force feedback wheel, input lag on one side, and then on the other side you have a guy with direct drive and low lag gaming monitor. They're playing completely different games, even though they're playing the same one, but things like that make a big difference. We've also seen things like the pedal linearity. If you don't check that box, like the curvature in the pedal, use a load cell pedal, you want that to be linear. People don't always do that. They get strange feel, have to press silly at some point to get any extra response, for example. Things like that all play a role. But another big one is your expectations. You are a guy or girl, it happens, playing a racing game. What do you expect from it? Are you any good? Do you feel you are? Now, there's one story here. It's a guy who does a bit of physics editing, and he tweaks the cars until he does the same lap times as the actual Formula 1 drivers did with that car on that track. Now, perhaps he's a great driver, could be fair, but the reality is he isn't that great. So why do you think you have the skill of actual champions, right? So where do you put yourself on the skills that you think you have, right? A really modest driver might say, well, I'm probably not very good at this, or, well, I've done some real driving, but I was never really a champion. So the fact that I spin out a lot in the simulator is probably fair. Whereas there will be plenty, and guys, people overestimate themselves all the time. It's only human. Plenty of people will say, well, I'm a pretty good driver. If I'm not sideways out of turn 1 by the 3rd lap, the simulator is wrong. These people exist too, right? And that's a very, very big thing, guys. Come on. How many times you see some YouTuber driving a car in a simulator and you wait a second. Should he be able to do that? And it's just a matter of your expectations of how good you are, how good you think you are, how good you think you can drive a car, and how difficult the sim is. So many variables, right? It's insane. And then, of course, there's the holy grail of real driver feedback. How often do you go on a forum or some vlog or whatever blog? You get people, I don't like the handling, and then, you've not driven it in real life, you cannot judge. Well, all right, can you, right? We already mentioned some differences between reality and sim. It's not the same. Guess what? And not all real drivers are automatically good drivers. Lots of people drive racing cars, and some are decent, some are great, some are not so great. So there's a big spread already, right? And even if you're a good real driver, perhaps you cannot adapt as well to the lack of G-forces, the lack of awareness of being there, turning off like the violence of everything with the G-forces and now being in a serene environment. Perhaps you just struggle. Or you have one of those poorly set up sims, right? So you're a very good driver, but in the sim you lock up all the time. Well, perhaps you're using an entry-level pedal set and you're used to 200 plus pounds in a real car. Of course you're gonna say the brakes are too easy to lock in the sim, but that's not necessarily because the sim is bad. It's just that doing the thing you're used to doing with the hardware you have at the moment doesn't work. So is this feedback valuable? No, not necessarily, right? Real driver, possibly even a good driver, bad sim hardware, opinion, not so worthful, mostly worthless, right? So, hard. What I've also seen is that drivers don't well, perhaps it's something to do with their expectations of skill. They get in the sim, which is properly or improperly set up, do a few laps, spin too often and say, the sim is terrible, there's not enough grip or whatever. Obviously, that's not necessarily a realistic thing to say because they're overestimating themselves, they haven't given it a proper go. So it does take the right type of driver who can filter out the stuff that isn't there in the simulator, who spends enough time and is talented enough to also become a good sim racer before perhaps you can say something about it. But we've already seen it's still subjective, right? So even then, it's pretty difficult. So, yeah. Another thing here, though, that's something I've seen some recently as well, perhaps, that some of these real drivers are actually extremely good at sim racing. And do they like a certain sim, or can they be excellent at a certain sim because the sim is realistic, or they are just highly skilled, highly competitive people who would be champion at Mario Kart as well, simply because they learn the skills required and they do a great job in the sim. So even real drivers doing great in a simulator doesn't necessarily mean it's realistic, other than perhaps they are just able to cope and adapt, and because they're very skillful, advanced human beings. So there we go again, with the data that goes in the sim is never quite accurate. The sim itself will not be quite accurate. You lack certain things in feeling. Perhaps some feelings in the simulator are actually better because you don't have certain sort of things that happen in real life. I should probably add another finger. The real drivers could be useful, but it's also subjective, and not everybody is capable of providing the feedback or filtering out for the stuff that they don't feel because it's not real, or they like the wrong things because they're not engineers all the time. Perhaps they make an error in what they assume realistic is because they expect to do a certain way in the sim, and perhaps their extreme skill makes them get away with this in a too hard simulator, or perhaps they aren't that skilled and they think the simulator should be easier. What about my 2 cents on this thing? Well, first of all, I think developers must try to get as much data as they can for each car. Speaks for itself, but just the fact that nothing is ever complete doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense to get as much data as you can. Because the fewer things you have to totally guess, the bigger the chance that something good will come out. But it doesn't stop there, right? So the developer should also acknowledge that perfection doesn't exist, and that there's always need for a room in the physics engine to tweak things, because you never know everything exactly, so you need the tweaking room. And the testers, like who to test the beta versions, they have to be, there have to be quite a few of them. Sim racers, perhaps experienced sim racers, real drivers, also especially rare, the type that's actually good at driving in reality and driving in the sim, and also with good hardware and good setup and some ability to sort of filter out the stuff that isn't happening in the sim, and not blame an easy locking brake on a light pedal, knowing that perhaps the brakes are just fine in the sim, but their pedal only goes to half the force that the real car does. It is really, really complicated and subjective at this point, right? So what I would hope is that perhaps if you have enough reasonably good people doing your testing, you get a lot of data points, a lot of noise, but perhaps some of the feedback will sort of be, there's a sort of an more than average complaint towards one direction, and then you can sort of work towards that. The more people you get to test, the more data points you get, and perhaps it tells you where to go. But a lot of the time you will be sort of in the subjective hands of the physics guys, perhaps, like me, or Aris from Sette Corsa, or whatever, anybody. You know, they will have to sort of juggle all these balls of unrealism and sort of blend them into an experience that they feel is good enough. Right, the end of the video then. Summary, and everybody can go home with a happy face. Well, if there's one thing I feel you can possibly learn, however, I'm just a guy with an opinion too, right? So I've just told you that everything is just sort of, to some extent, there's always wiggle room and room for improvement. Same goes for me. I'm just a guy with an opinion, so don't trust me. And also don't follow YouTubers blindly, or don't think that just because somebody is a real driver and he makes YouTube videos that he's always right, or that your favorite sim racing YouTuber with his opinion is right. No, probably a lot of the time nobody is right. There is just this vagueness around realism and how hard should a sim be, how easy should it be. There is not one individual, I think, that has the answer to this. So I think everybody, if you consume content, if you consume racing games or sims, if you make content about it on YouTube or whatever you do, if you're a sim developer, you need to have a lot of humble pie. And I should probably eat a bit more because it definitely affects me as well, of course. Being humble and being open to things not being quite like you think they are is super important. So never put your like heels in the sand and get out the pitchforks. Stay open to what is realistic and what is not, and don't blindly follow something or a developer or a YouTuber. Humble pie, ladies and gentlemen. I think that's the only conclusion we can draw from this video. Now I'm hungry. Hope you found this interesting. See you later. Bye bye. Comments, rotten fruit down below. Bye bye.